Hello there, I'm Jonathan Graham. My thesis research took a deep dive into the communication strategy of a large government agency, the Department of Homeland Security. I started this research project with a simple question and assumption. The assumption was that many Americans disliked the immigration enforcement work of DHS during the Trump administration. My question was, how could that perception be improved? What could we learn from the communications put out by DHS during times of crisis? So a little about me. I'm an attorney by trade. I have experience working in several areas of federal administrative law. But for my research, I wanted to step out of my comfort zone and address what we in Homeland Security at the enterprise sometimes call a wicked or thorny problem and tackle a subject that I was not that familiar with. These types of wicked problems are at times believed to be unsolvable, or at least to be so complex that solutions are quite difficult. My thesis project was called Strategic Communications in the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration Policies, Mixed Messaging, and Information Fratricide. Breaking down this title into some of the key components, Information Fratricide was originally a military term, a form of friendly fire where one official's communications publicly undermined and contradicted the messaging of another official. The consequence is that the public may be confused or feel misled. Mixed messaging is somewhat similar and refers to messaging from an agency which leaves the public confused about policy justifications or the rationale for adopting a given policy. And third, I looked at what is strategy more broadly. The research discussed characteristics of solid strategy for organizations generally, and then narrowed the focus to the strategies specific to communications with the public. So finally, what is strategic communications? To answer this, my project examined the notion of strategic communications in the literature and applied it to several case studies from DHS. The idea for this project came from seeing the public outrage over several DHS immigration policies during the prior administration. And these were the separation of parents and children who illegally entered the U.S. as family units across the southern border, and the policy where non-citizens in immigration court were required to remain in Mexico during the months between their court hearings. But I didn't want to get into a finger-pointing political debate or analysis. I wanted to focus into a part of the debate that, in my view, had been neglected, and that was communications. What was DHS doing well or poorly to sell its policies? How was DHS communicating with the public about these policies? And were these communications effective? Or to use concepts from the literature, did these communications accomplish any strategic objectives? More broadly, was it apparent to the public or outsiders that DHS even had any strategic objectives in its chosen communications preferences? I thought these questions are important because it matters what our leadership says, how they say it, and whether or not the public believes them. A project should have clear research questions which can be clearly answered within the scope of the project and the time and resources available. So I focused my specific research questions on how DHS conducts strategic communications about such controversial policies and what metrics or evaluation model could be used to measure such communications. So to summarize my research in a nutshell, I used a media content analysis to show that DHS displayed both mixed messaging and information fratricide during these two policy rollouts in 2018 to 2019, which hurt the agency's efforts in the end. The research showed that the administration made plenty of communications mistakes, but it also demonstrated a capacity to improve communication strategies over time. DHS used messaging which was at times inconsistent and even contradictory, but there was improvement from one policy to the next. There were lessons to be learned from all of this, both for future DHS policy rollouts, as well as for smaller scale policy rollouts by other law enforcement agencies. The part of my research on good strategy, as a separate concept from strategic communications, revealed a process through which an agency can take stock of its key communication strengths and weaknesses and use those strengths to accomplish a handful of top objectives during a time of crisis. Richard Rumelt is an important author in the field of strategy research, and he believes that good strategy requires focusing on the top 2 to 3 organizational strengths and applying these strengths at key pivot points during times of organizational challenge. So good strategy has nothing to do with lengthy strategic goals documents or pointless strategic planning meetings where nothing really gets done. Instead, good strategy is all about identifying, in simple terms, what your organization is good at and applying it at the correct time. But how could I use the literature to accomplish this research project? I knew a lot about the policies at issue, but I didn't know much at all about strategic communications theories or evaluation practices. I learned there are quite a few ways of defining and viewing strategic communications. There is a planning aspect and also an after-the-fact evaluation aspect. The literature calls this latter aspect measurement and evaluation. Dozens of models have been developed over the decades to assist researchers in measuring and evaluating communications. As you might expect, there is a lot of overlap with the field of public relations, advertising, and marketing. And a lot of those models are more applicable for those fields where an organization is trying to sell a product or service rather than a public policy. But there is a sizable part of the more recent literature which has indeed focused on public communications, such as those of DHS and government agencies. Professor Jim McNamara of Australia has been a leading voice in this field, and his work was quite important in my research. So I started with the existing public communications models and very quickly came to the realization that they didn't help me much, practically speaking. If I have a finite and limited set of data consisting of a set of publicly available statements from DHS officials about these two controversial policies, how was I supposed to use these vague models to evaluate my set of communications? All of these models were high level, taking the 30,000-foot view, and didn't provide much hands-on guidance or process on how to analyze specific examples of communications. In other words, what I needed was a process to analyze the specific words coming out of a speaker's mouth and to reach rational, repeatable, and justifiable conclusions. So I developed my own model, which looked at strategy, messaging, and language of sample communications output of an organization in that order. These three sections of the model correspond to the strategic, the tactical, and the ground-level operational decisions made by the agency's communications professionals. The model identifies factors and characteristics of a sample of communications work product which correspond to each of these stages of decision-making. The model is useful because it provides an organized and systematic way to approach a set of communications and to generate conclusions about how well an agency's communications use the desirable factors identified in the model and how well they avoid the undesirable factors and characteristics. So turning to the two case studies that I researched, the parent-child separation policy, or zero tolerance, was rolled out in 2018 and required criminal enforcement of any non-citizen who entered the U.S. illegally with children. The parents were charged with the crime of illegal entry and sent to criminal custody, while the children were separated and remained in government immigration custody. The second case study was known as the Migrant Protection Protocols in 2019, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy. This policy required that individuals apprehended at the border were required to remain in Mexico and attend court dates at tent court locations held at multiple sites along the border, but they were not allowed to remain in the U.S. between court hearings. So how did I use this model to address these examples of communications? I ran all of the major communications examples that I could find on these subjects through the model and drew several conclusions. First, the parent-child separation policy was a prototypical example of information fratricide. There were frequent examples of mixed messaging coming from different agencies, each of which had a piece of the pie, and mixed messaging coming from officials at different levels of even the same organizations. By contrast, the communications on the Remain in Mexico policy showed an evolution and improvement in the ability of DHS to successfully engage in targeted, on-message communications related to these enforcement efforts. The messaging was much more consistent, speakers stayed on message, and they did not publicly contradict each other. Also, DHS was the first out of the gate with many press releases on the second policy, and they gained a strategic advantage by being the first to frame the issue and to mount a defense against critics even before criticism begins. The literature refers to this as the, quote, inoculation effect, and this has an incredibly powerful effect and is a powerful strategy to use when discussing controversial policies with the public. So a few final thoughts on what I took away from this project. On the subject matter of these policies, I learned a lot about DHS communications strengths and weaknesses, and had good takeaways for future communications planning for the agency. More broadly, though, there are lessons here about the research process in Homeland Security generally. For example, process modeling of human factors, such as communications processes, can reveal insights about whether our communications efforts are working and are effective. This sort of process modeling can help with issue spotting of deficiencies. And identification of an agency's top communication strengths can lead to more effective strategic communications and improved stakeholder engagement. This is vital in the current area of social media, with almost real-time visibility of practically everything that a law enforcement agency does in public. One of the open questions from the literature is the extent to which a communication strategy can be planned or pushed out from the top down of an organization, or whether that strategy is, quote, emergent as a result of communicators and stakeholders interacting in the laboratory of life. This is especially important for adversarial populations, which hold interests significantly at odds with the policy preferences of an agency. My hope is that this methodology and evaluation model can be used by other large public organizations, specifically law enforcement agencies, as a tool to measure how well their communications output accomplishes their key objectives, and to plan more effectively for future communications efforts. Finally, this work serves as a reminder that communications about a policy should be a part of the policy planning process from day one, and not merely an afterthought once a policy is already in place. Thank you for listening, and the best of luck as your organization improves its public communications skills.